Good morning, Mr. Maybeck. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, DCJ. DCJ.
Morning, Chair.
Good morning, Mr. Solomon. Good morning, Mr. Gigaba.
Good morning, Chair.
Mr. Halley is here. I understand he would like to address you before I begin, if that is in order.
Yes, let's get that out of the way. Yes, Mr. Halley, you can do so from where you are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as you're aware, we were supposed to commence this morning with the testimony of Major General Mnenope. Now, we had served a summons on Major General Mnenope, and we were still apparently awaiting the return of service from the sheriff. When we made inquiries during the course of yesterday, it turned out that the summons had been served, but apparently on the wrong address. So the consequence has been that when we contacted Major General Mnenope, she indicated that because she wasn't aware of the matter, she wasn't prepared to come and testify at such short notice, but has indicated that she will be willing to testify, even at short notice, but obviously not today. So I've given her certain dates that I would try to chat with you about, Mr. Chair. But obviously, since we haven't yet had an opportunity to speak to each other, I can't yet give her those dates or assure of those dates. But we will. That's where we are at the moment.
No, that's fine. We will talk and see what can be done. Of course, there is a problem with dates that we all know because of our time constraints. But we will talk and then take it from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
My apologies as far as this is concerned.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you. Before we proceed, Mr. Maybeck, I understand that when I announced yesterday that Mr. Agrizi would be testifying today, or would be cross-examined by Mr. Wakeford's counsel, I was mistaken. That had been the original date, but that I had subsequently approved that he be moved to tomorrow. So I'm just making a correction for the benefit of the public. So nobody should say Mr. Agrizi was meant to be here and he didn't pitch. So I got my information wrong. So he's only going to be here tomorrow, virtually, not physically, and he will be cross-examined by counsel for Mr. Wakeford. The consequence of that, Mr. Maybeck, for us is that we have a little bit more time for Mr. Gigaba's evidence than we thought we would have, should we need it. Obviously, we want to finish as soon as possible, but at a practical level, it does mean that instead of Mr. Agrizi needing to testify at 12, the next witness would be after lunch, Brigadier Gigaba. So I just mentioned that for what it's worth.
Yes. As you know, DCJ, we're going to try and squeeze in Mr. Benjamin at 12 o'clock.
Yes, no, that's fine. I just wanted you to understand, because I think you have been trying to squeeze things through, and the time has not been on our side. Okay, no, that's all right. But maybe we do need to get Mr. Gigaba to do the oath again. Please just administer the oath again.
Please state your full names for the record.
Knowledge Malusi Gigaba.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No.
Do you consider the oath binding on your conscience?
Yes.
Do you solemnly swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you. Okay, Mr.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Gigaba.
Good morning, Mr. Maibek.
I think you should have open in front of you bundle 11. I just want to take you, please, to page 837.125. We have, since the last sitting, added your statement, written statement in response to Ms. Carolus.
Yes.
Could I just direct your attention, please, to paragraph 13,
Yes.
which you find at the foot of the page?
Yes.
Where you state that as minister, I was cautious to ensure that I executed my duties
Yes.
in relation to SOEs with due respect for my and the board's respective mandates. I understood my role to be largely limited to giving policy direction to the SOE, whereas the board's operational functions were not within my remit. With respect to decisions to abandon airline routes, this an issue which could be dealt with by the department. It would be brought to the minister for approval once the department had completed an independent assessment of the application. Do you confirm that?
Yes.
Could I then ask you, please, to turn to bundle 10. And if I could ask you, please, to turn to page 494 of bundle 10. You find at page 494 the commencement of quite a lengthy statement by Mr. Mamoniat. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you'll see if you go to page 498 at paragraph 1, Mr. Mamoniat is a Deputy Director General at National Treasury. Do you see that?
Yes, I'm aware.
And if I could then ask you, please, to go to page 500. The previous page, 499 at paragraph 7.
Yes.
He sets out what his evidence relates to. And the issue that I'd like to deal with briefly is stated at page 500, paragraph 7.9, where he says his evidence relates to the attempt by the Justice, Crime Prevention and Security, JCPS, cluster ministers and the National Director of Public Prosecutions, NDPP, to change, delay, and stop the FICA bill. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, this is something that you have dealt with in your statement. If I could ask you to go to the back of the file. And in particular, could I ask you to have a look at page, I think it is the last page, in fact, 966.
Yes.
What you say at paragraph 17 is that what puts paid to any suggestion on the part of Mamoniat of my involvement in some broader conspiracy of state capture is the fact that notwithstanding the JCPS having sought certain clarifications about the FICA Amendment Bill, when I became the Minister of Finance, I was the driver and facilitated the resolution of those concerns thereby enabling the FICA Amendment Bill to be passed and not scrapped, in brackets, which would appear to be Mammoniat's hypothesis. You see that?
Yes.
You confirm that?
Yes.
Now, this particular issue is dealt with over just a few pages in Mr. Mammoniat's statement. Perhaps I could ask you to turn up.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mybeck, is there a signed version of this affidavit of Mr. Gigaba? The one I have here is not signed. Do you know, Mr. Gigaba, if there is a signed version already or not yet?
Yes, we had sent it, Mr. Chairperson. We first sent because of trying to comply with the times.
Yes.
We first sent this, we indicated that we would subsequently email a signed affidavit.
And it was sent?
It was sent by the state attorney.
Okay, no, that's fine.
We'll take steps then to replace this,
Yes.
to supplement it, DCJ.
Okay, all right.
Now, I was mentioning that Mr. Mammoniat deals with this issue over a few pages, commencing at page 608. Perhaps I could ask you to turn. Now, Mr. Gigaba, perhaps just in relation to your position as the Minister of Finance, and you've already touched on that in your statement. You were the Minister of Finance when the FICA bill was signed into law by the former President on the 26th of April 2017, correct?
Yes, yes.
And you were the Minister of Finance who gazetted the commencement dates for the FICA Act.
Yes.
And some of those were on the 13th of June 2017.
Yes.
And would you also confirm that at the time, South Africa was under pressure from the Financial Action Task Force, the so-called FATF, an international body, for the FICA bill to commence?
Yes.
Would you confirm that?
Yes.
And in fact, it could have been said that South Africa was in violation of its international commitments regarding its anti-money laundering legislation. Would you confirm that?
Yes, sir. But I think it's important to state that South Africa is also a sovereign nation, that it reserves every right to satisfy itself that the legislation which is going to be passed is subject to our law and constitution. There are many international bodies to which South Africa belongs. Many of them would from time to time apply pressure on issues, some of which we would have agreed to. South Africa is not an exception in this regard, that countries would still want to exercise their sovereign right not to pass any legislation or law or policy without scrutinizing it and ensuring that it's subject to the constitution and other laws of that country. So there was nothing peculiar here. It would be a sad day if we would arrive at the conclusion that international bodies can simply force upon us any policy or legislation that we must sign without satisfying ourselves. We have a parliament which is an arm of the state, which does not just receive legislation and pass it without subjecting it to parliamentary processes. We have cabinet, which is not a rubber stamp for anything. There were issues at the time that cabinet was concerned with that it needed clarified. And once those things were clarified, then we proceeded to sign the legislation. It wasn't because SATF was forcing it upon us. It was because we were now satisfied that South African government's concerns had been addressed. I think the sovereignty of our nation should at all times be understood and observed.
So before you took up your position as Minister of Finance, you were the Minister of Home Affairs. And would you confirm then that in that capacity you were a member of the JCPS cluster in 2016 and early 2017?
Chairperson, I was a member of the JCPS cluster. And the JCPS cluster doesn't consist of the Minister of Home Affairs alone or of Malusi Gigaba. And that is why the submission by Mr. Momoniat is not only malicious, it's disingenuous. In that, if the JCPS cluster as a whole was concerned about certain aspects of the legislation of this FICA amendment, it wasn't me as an individual, and it wasn't the Department of Home Affairs that was concerned. There were a number of departments that were concerned. They included State Security, the Department of Defense. They included a number of other departments that were concerned about this. And that is why, when I became Minister of Finance, I sought to facilitate a meeting with the relevant departments, and the Department of Home Affairs was not one of those, in order to resolve this issue. And that is why, subsequently, the bill went through.
So as a member then of the JCPS cluster, you would have attended meetings and been privy to discussions within the cluster, I take it?
Yes.
And I take it also that you would have been aware of the letter and submissions sent to the chairperson of Parliament's Standing Committee on Finance by the Minister of Defence and Military Veterans in her capacity as chairperson of the JCPS cluster, dated the 23rd of January 2017.
I don't think I was, but I don't recall, Chair, if I had seen that letter.
Well, perhaps you could keep your finger at page 608, and let me take you to that document.
Page 608.
Keep your finger at 608, because we're
Okay.
going to come back there. Can you turn forward to page, I think it is 912.
Page 912.
Yeah, 912. So you see there's the covering letter to the chairperson of the Standing Committee. You go to 913, from the chairperson of the Justice, Crime Prevention and Security Cluster. It's dated the 23rd of January. And attached to it was a submission, which you find at page 914.
Right.
You seen that?
Yes.
And what this submission does is it makes the argument that Section 45, capital B in brackets 1, capital C of the bill regarding search and seizures is unconstitutional. You would have seen that?
What paragraph is that?
Well, I think it's the thrust of the submission.
I think, given that I've not seen the submission, Chair, and don't recall seeing it, it's difficult for me to confirm whether that's the thrust of the submission or not.
Have a look at page 936, concluding submissions, paragraph 114. It's requested that the impugned provision of the bill, particularly section 45, capital B in brackets 1, capital C, relating to search and seizures be removed, as it not only usurps the powers of other law enforcement authorities, but also is overly broad and in effect unconstitutional. See that?
Yes.
So are you saying that you didn't see this submission from the chairperson of the cluster, the JCPS cluster, albeit that you are a member of it?
The chairperson of the cluster would, in drafting this letter, forward it to Parliament, summarizing through the Cabinet Secretariat the issues which had been discussed by the cluster, and I don't think they would have sent this letter to us. As I say, I don't recall seeing it.
Yes, but you, no doubt, were of the same mind. This comes from the chairperson of the cluster.
It was the collective opinion
Yes.
of the cluster, yes.
Correct. So if we could then go back to page 608, and I think there's only 3 paragraphs I want to ask you about here. Paragraph 236 says Mr. Moniat. This was an unprecedented step for any minister, let alone the entire cluster of the cabinet, to object to the legislature against a bill that was previously approved by cabinet and passed by parliament. I'm not aware of this having happened before or since, and to do so without going back to cabinet first. This was a bill that had been adopted by cabinet after a series of meetings over almost a full year. Most of the JCPS cluster ministers had attended most, if not all, the cabinet or its committee meetings in 2014-15, and were certainly not passive participants on the bill. They did not take their newfound concern to cabinet and were now acting unilaterally to effectively reverse a cabinet decision of which they were part. Do you want to comment on that?
Chairperson, the mere fact that something has not happened before doesn't mean that it cannot happen. South Africa has never had a commission of inquiry on alleged state capture, and it's happened before. It's happened now. So if somebody were to argue that this thing hasn't happened before, therefore it shouldn't happen, they would be wrong. We had a democracy for the first time in 1994, and it had not existed before in South Africa. So my view is that Mr. Momoniat is expressing, Mr. Momoniat was very passionate about this legislation. He's very passionate about these issues. And so he took the view, which in some instances was considered rude and arrogant towards his political principles. When the political principles were engaging with the issue with a view of resolving it. What Minister Mapisa Ngagula is suggesting here as the chairperson, or was suggesting as the chairperson of the cluster in this letter, was not that the FICA legislation be scrapped altogether. She was saying there are issues we were concerned about, which were considered, some of which were considered unconstitutional. South Africa has a constitution, Chairperson, and that constitution is sovereign and overrides any other letter of law that exists in this country. Cabinet has to ensure compliance with the constitution when they adopt any legislation. In the South African instance, in most instances, legislation originates from cabinet, and therefore cabinet would exercise its mind with regard to any legislation and even reserves the right to repeal existing legislation. Now, if Mr. Momoniat says he's not aware of an instance where cabinet had decided to repeal existing legislation, he's lying. He's lying. He knows that it has happened. There's a lot of legislation since 1994 which has been repealed through processes that cabinet would have undertaken. And so there was nothing peculiar here. I think what was necessary was the engagement on the issues that were being raised, and that is why in 2017 we facilitated discussions which then resolved concerns around some of those issues. And then the legislation was passed and we complied with FATF expectations.
If I could just then take you in relation to the objection to the constitutionality of the bill, to paragraph 237 at page 609. At no stage at the many cabinet or its committee meetings where the FICA bill was considered did any minister object to the constitutionality of the bill or raise concerns regarding warrantless searches and the phasing out of the Counter Money Laundering Advisory Council, which had not changed much during the parliamentary process. Indeed, the only constitutional matter that had emerged from the drafting of the bill was the clause on warrantless searches, which was guided by the judgment of the Constitutional Court in the Auction Alliance case. There was no constitutional objections to the PEP's or PIP's clause, as I explained above. The bill submitted to President Zuma for assent in May 2016 did not substantially differ from the original bill first submitted to Cabinet in 2014 for the clauses related to the Counter Money Laundering Advisory Council, unlike the PEP/PRP clauses. Do you want to comment on that?
Though I don't understand, Chairperson, why these issues are brought to me. I was not Chairperson of the committee at the time. I was only one of the members. I'm not sure whether the same questions are being asked all other ministers or former ministers who were members of this committee. But that notwithstanding, it's important to point out that Mr. Momoniat was not a member of the cabinet. And so he cannot speak with authority on debates and discussions within the cabinet. An issue, it does happen that an issue can be discussed by a relevant cabinet committee, the JCPS cabinet committee, for instance, or the cluster, where the relevant officials would be invited to contribute and to sit in during discussion so that they can take note of the issues being raised by the ministers. But when the matter serves before cabinet, through the report submitted by the committee, because what happens in the South African cabinet process, the cabinet committees meet this week and discuss issues. Then a report is submitted the following week to the cabinet meeting, which entails recommended decisions that need to be adopted by cabinet. But it does happen that when those decisions are being tabled, those recommendations are being tabled, cabinet members, some of whom might even have been at the previous meeting, would have applied their minds further, would have developed new opinions or done additional report, and they would then flag issues out and say, though I was part of this discussion, but I have an opinion on this matter that I would like to present. The precedents, and I have served under 4, they don't curtail cabinet discussions. It's not in their habit to say, Minister, you were part of a meeting last week, therefore you can't talk. They allow you to speak because they want to create an environment where no member of the national executive feels that they are being muzzled on discussions, because the decisions in the end must constitute the collective opinion of all of us, and therefore we are accountable for those decisions. And so the process of discussion was allowed, and Mr. Momoniat would not have been party to all of those discussions, because in the end he's not a member of the cabinet, and we would not know who has raised what concerns. There were serious concerns being raised about the concepts of PEPs or PIPs, even as the bill was finalized. Those concerns still stand among many people as to who is a PEP, who is a PIP, who designates these, are senior executives of business in South Africa and their families, PEPs, also part of the PEPs or PIPs. So there were many discussions, Chairperson, which took place, many of which were raised in relation to the constitutionality of the legislation before us.
Mr. Maibek, what does Mr. Momoniat's evidence seek to show insofar as Mr. Gigaba is concerned?
Well,
bearing in mind what we are focusing on.
Mr. Mamaniat's evidence is really confined to this single issue, and that is Mr. Gigaba's role as a member of the JCPS.
Yes, but as you understand his...
Well, as I understand it, what
he wants to show what, for what purpose?
Well, what he ultimately says is that this was vexatious, and the conclusion is that the failure to pass this bill would have been convenient for the Guptas and their associates' attempts to launder money and, in fact, buy a bank if it had been delayed. So that's the conclusion that he comes to. I'm going to ask Mr. Gigaba to comment on that.
Because if he says it would have been convenient, but he is not saying Mr. Gigaba took steps with an agenda to assist the Guptas because the Guptas didn't want this law to be passed. I'm not sure.
Well, I think that is in effect what he's saying.
Is that what
Chairperson, yes.
Yes. Okay, maybe you can focus.
Yeah, I'll try and do that. I don't have a lot more questions for Mr. Gigaba on this.
Okay, all right.
In fact, let me take you to two more paragraphs. 238. The JCPS cluster letter did not have a formal legal opinion to support its view, but instead their letter took the form of an informal legal opinion, although it was more of a political opinion in my view. Their letter purported to provide more detail on the concerns of President Zuma by stating, quote, "The President is further concerned," this is what the submission stated, "the President is further concerned of the impact would have on the rights of persons identified as foreign prominent officials, domestic prominent influential person and family members, and known associates of the aforementioned persons." So they were now also raising the constitutionality of the PIPS clause, despite the fact that this concept was extensively discussed and amended by Cabinet. They claimed that all these clauses are discriminatory and therefore unconstitutional. They called for removing these clauses and concepts. It was also odd to me that they appeared to know more of President Zuma's concerns than the Treasury, and I wondered whether President Zuma had in fact discussed these concerns with the JCPS ministers when he did not do so with the responsible minister, the Minister of Finance. Do you want to comment on that insofar as you can?
Yes, I will comment, Chairperson, even though I still don't see where and how this is relevant to me. No assertion is being made here about myself, other than about President Zuma. Let me start by saying, Chairperson, Mr. Momoniat or any other official of government cannot prescribe to Cabinet how to conduct its business. It's got absolutely no right.
And I guess that as officials, you may be aggrieved about how your minister has handled a certain matter or how Cabinet has handled the matter. Sometimes you are excited, sometimes you are disappointed. That's part of life, and
yes,
and Cabinet plays the role that it plays, and obviously, in a commission such as this, if there is something concrete to be said that helps the commission, that's fine. But there are situations where even among yourselves as cabinet ministers, you might not be happy with how a colleague of yours is handling a certain matter that maybe is very much in the public domain. But sometimes you'll be happy, sometimes you won't be happy. And maybe you can't even talk publicly, you have to talk only within cabinet. These things happen.
And life continues. Chairperson, let me, in support of what the Chairperson has just raised, cite at least one example. In May 2014, I was appointed Minister of Home Affairs. A few days thereafter, as part of the briefings which had been provided to me by the Director General and the top officials of Home Affairs, the department announced new visa regulations. A whole range of things were announced there, including a requirement for unabridged birth certificates, a requirement for parents, if they are traveling alone, whether out of the country or into the country, to produce a supporting affidavit from one of the parents to allow them to travel with children, to produce unabridged birth certificates for the minor children, and a whole range of other things. The Cabinet had discussed and passed this prior to the new administration being established. So what the department was doing through the minister was to announce the visa regulations as having been agreed to by cabinet previously and based on an amendment to the immigration legislation which had been passed through parliament and assented by the president. Now, after making this announcement, the then Minister of Tourism raised serious concerns about the impact of these regulations on the tourism sector. Our argument at Home Affairs was that, but these had passed through cabinet. Cabinet had adopted these. The legislation is passed by parliament, and nobody raised these objections because they are contained not only in the current amendments of the Immigration Act, but they were contained in the Children's Act. Because the Children's Act itself had said no child must be allowed to leave South Africa or enter South Africa without producing a full birth certificate of that child, and without, if the child is traveling with a guardian or with one parent, there must be consent, a written and signed consent by the other parent. After a long discussion, Cabinet decided to establish an interministerial committee which would be chaired by the former Deputy President, who is now the President of the Republic, which arrived at certain amendments which sought to accommodate the Department of Tourism. I never thought that by so doing, Cabinet was acting as a captured institution by any interest. I never took that to mean Cabinet was now backtracking on its own decisions, which had been passed where nobody had raised the concerns that the Department of Tourism was raising. And those amendments to the regulations were passed, and we announced additional amendments a couple of years later, I think in 2018, and additional amendments have been announced, I think, if not last year, then it was in 2019. So it is within normal practice that Cabinet could, even though they had been no objection to a particular item, that Cabinet would say, we think that we've probably been heavy-handed, or for some other valid reason, we propose that we change here and there.
Yeah.
And that was the experience here.
Could I ask you to go to paragraph 243, please? This is at page 612. Given the letter from the JCPS cluster ministers, which showed that there were now open differences with the FICA bill within Cabinet, the chairperson of SCOF, Mr. Yunus Karim, decided to convene a study group meeting of the ANC SCOF members on 24 January 2017 to resolve the differences between Cabinet ministers. You see that?
Yes.
And then, can I take you to page 615 at paragraph 252? Says the ANC Finance Study Group emphasized that they did not agree with the points on constitutionality that Minister Mashutha had raised. They told him that they had properly applied their minds to the issues that he was raising when they considered the bill. They in fact pointed out that this submission made by the JCPS cluster was embarrassing and requested it to be withdrawn and not serve on the agenda the following day. You want to comment on that?
I was not in the meeting, Chairperson. Thank you.
So can you dispute that they've described it as embarrassing?
I was not in the meeting, Chairperson.
I take it you can't then. So...
Nor can I confirm.
Yeah.
I can neither deny nor confirm that such was said. I was not in the meeting. Mr. Momoniat has the penchant to omit certain crucial issues in this affidavit. And that is why it becomes difficult for me. Glaring in his affidavit is the mere fact, the consideration that eventually in 2017, I facilitated meetings with the Department of Justice, State Security, Defense, and others which finally brokered an agreement. It's quite glaring that he omits this, and I'm expected to take his view on this, on his submission to be true. I'm unable to.
And then he mentions at paragraph 254 that the memo was withdrawn, that there was a withdrawal of their memo. Are you in a position to confirm or dispute that?
I can neither confirm nor deny.
All right. Now, perhaps I could take you, Chairperson, to perhaps answer more directly the question that you asked of me.
Yes.
If you could please go to page 419 of the Rule 33 notice. I had read paragraph 7.9 of Mr. Momiat's affidavit, but there the specific allegation is captured at page 419, paragraph 2.2, that you sought to weaken South Africa.
Sorry,
Wait.
page 419.
419, paragraph 2.2, right at the top, Chairperson.
No.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, 491.
Another bundle.
No, I beg your pardon. I'm sorry, not 419, 491.
491, okay. Yes, okay. 2.2 at the top.
2.2, sought to weaken South Africa's anti-corruption and anti-money laundering legislation and financial regulatory framework by attempting to delay the passing of the Financial Intelligence Centre Amendment Bill to serve the interests of the Gupta family whilst you were a member of the JCPS cluster. You want to comment on that?
Chairperson, we've gone through this affidavit, I think since we started the affidavit by Mr. Momoniat. Nowhere does it point to me, Malusi Gigaba,
I don't want to...
as being responsible for delaying the passing of the Financial Intelligence Center Amendment Bill and to serve the private interests of the Gupta family. Obviously, this was inserted here by the person who wrote this 3.3 notice to me. It's not in Mr. Momoniat's affidavit.
Okay.
So I think I've already put the proposition to you that what Mr. Moniat says, or his proposition, is that it would have been convenient for the Guptas and their associates' attempts to launder money and in fact buy a bank if the bill was delayed. Do you want to comment on that?
But what has that got to do with me? Mr. Momoniat does not say that I, Malusi Gigaba, did what is being put to me. So what has it got to do with me? Who is making this allegation? Because it's not Mr. Momoniat.
I think he's making that allegation in the context of you having been a member of the JCPS cluster, Mr. Gigaba.
But in that instance, Chairperson, the chairperson of the cluster should have been called to answer on behalf of the cluster, not a resigned member of cabinet. The mere fact that I served in cabinet at the time doesn't mean, and I was a member of the cluster, doesn't mean that I chaired the cluster, I deputized the cluster, nor does Mr. Momoniat point to me, Malusi Gigaba, as being responsible for this. It's quite clear that this is being deliberately inserted, but it's not been said by Mr. Momoniat. So why is it being put to me, and why is the assertion being made that I sought to delay the passing of the Financial Intelligence Amendment Bill, Center Amendment Bill, to serve the private interests of the Guptas? Who is saying this? Mr. Momoniat didn't say it.
Well, while somebody was speaking to you, Mr. Maibek, Mr. Gigaba, one of the points he was making was that when you look at Mr. Momoniat's affidavit, he doesn't make any allegations of fact with regard to him specifically.
I agree. He talks about him in the context of being a member of the cluster.
Yes. I think we can move on.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Can I then take you, please, to the same file for bundle 10 that you're in, and let's go to Mr. Bishop's affidavit that you find at page 6.
Page number
Page 6, Chairperson.
of the same bundle.
Same bundle under tab 7.
Okay. Yes.
Now, perhaps we can...
Sorry, Chairperson, if I may raise this as well.
Yeah.
You know, in the 3.3 which was served to me
Yeah.
on Mr. Momoniat, I'd like to just go back. On page 490,
Yeah.
paragraph 2.1, it said that Mr. Momoniat made an allegation that I sought to replace certain officials within the National Treasury on the instruction of the Gupta family whilst I was a member of whilst I was the Minister of Finance. I would like to be pointed to that section in Mr. Momoniat's affidavit, which makes this allegation.
Okay.
Because if by the assertion of the evidence leader, Mr. Momoniat confined himself to the FIC amendment bill process, where did he
You want
make
to
this
know
allegation?
where that came from?
Yes.
Well, where it's dealt with, I mean, the 3.3 says there are two issues. I've dealt with one, it's the latter one. The first issue is dealt with in paragraphs 15 and 16 of Mr. Moniat's statement. And in fact, Mr. Gigaba was directed to those paragraphs in paragraph 3 of the 3.3 notice. 15 and 16, I've deliberately decided not to question Mr. Gigaba on this in the interests of time, but there are Mr. Momoniat's allegations in relation to the first issue.
Yes.
And therefore, these are the issues in 2.2 which implicate me and to which I have responded in great detail. Because again, Mr. Momoniat in this regard makes an allegation and provides absolutely no evidence of the allegation that he is making. In my response, I have detailed all the people who were appointed whilst I was Minister of Finance, and no one, and I indicate there that there was never an attempt on my part to replace anyone. From the position of the Director General, the positions of Deputy Directors General, and the other positions that we appointed whilst I was at National Treasury. I indicate that perhaps with the exception of the one person who was the head of the FIC, who was appointed as the head of the FIC, who had been the head of the NPA in the Free State, and who is still occupying the position now, an experienced public prosecutor. I indicate that all the people that we appointed in all the positions, without fail, were members of the National Treasury who had served in the National Treasury for more than 10 years. And so there was no one who was ever appointed from outside the National Treasury except the head of the FIC, who was appointed in an attempt to replace anyone. The people who got appointed to those positions were appointed because there were vacancies which had been either existing prior to my appointment or which got created in 2 or 3 instances when people who were serving at the time resigned. But there was no one who was replaced or whom we sought to replace because we had been asked by the Guptas. And I indicate that if these people in the National Treasury who got appointed to these positions had been associates of the Guptas, then that's their problem. Because no one, not even the National Treasury itself, said to us that, oh, these people who had served here for more than 10 years are actually associates of the Guptas. And to my knowledge, and I can say this without any fear of contradiction, none of those people were ever associated with the Guptas, not even at any stage in their lives.
Thank you. If you could go back then, please, to Mr. Bishop's statement, which starts at page 6. And can I take you to page 18 and to paragraph 34? Now this, as you
Yes,
know,
I'm there.
relates to Alex Call, Mr. Gigaba.
Yes.
I just want to ask you a few questions in relation to a couple of issues. At paragraph 34, Mr. Bishop says that in the government media statement of 7 September 2012, media address by Malusi Gigaba MP, etc., on occasion of the annual general meeting of the Board of Directors, it stated that, and can I take you to the second paragraph in this regard, I have appointed Mr. Rafik Bagus as chairperson of the new board. And then the last sentence says, I've given the new board the responsibility to fill the vacancies of CEO and CFO forthwith by no later than the next 3 months. Would you confirm that?
Yes.
At paragraph 35, key to these appointments was Bagus, the new chairperson of the board of Alex Corp. And then it sets out that he was previously the Chief Executive of Trade and Investment South Africa, Deputy Director General of the Department of Trade and Industry, and a Special Advisor to Alec Irwin. At 36, Bagus did not waste any time in commencing with the new strategic direction, diversification into coal, announced by Mr. Gigaba. Below is an excerpt from Bagus's forward to Alex Corp's 2013 annual report. And we'll come back to that, but he announces there that there's going to be diversification by Alex Corp into coal mining and the provision of coal to Eskom. Do you see that?
Yes, I see.
Now, if I could take you, please, to page 21, paragraph 37.
I'm there.
At paragraph 37, it says, on an examination, or when on examining the cell phone records for Bagus, we noted that he made telephonic contact with the Gupta brothers and their associates. At 37.1, you see there's reference to Mr. Iqbal Sharma, 37.2, Ashu Shwala, 37.3, AJ Gupta, 37.4, Ranesh Gupta. At 38, says that Bagus attended the Sun City Gupta wedding and stayed in room 1205. The dates are set out. And then at 39, according to the Amabungani article, Bagus came to public attention in 2011 when he was linked to making political introductions to a Uruguayan businessman, Gaston Salvi, who is still battling corruption charges relating to government tender awards, which have been dealt with in the evidence of Mr. Trevor White and Colonel Pete Deploy before the Commission. Bagus is also featured during evidence led at the Commission in relation to SAA and in numerous media articles concerning state capture and corruption. Now, I just wanted to get your comment on this. I mean, here, Bagus is appointed as the chairperson, and you'll see these references to links to the Guptas and their associates. Do you have any comments on that?
Of importance, among others, Chairperson, is that first, Mr. Bagus had come with a very good record in the public service, and he, at the point that we appointed him as chairperson, we didn't have the technology to examine his phone records, as would happen thereafter. But if you look at the phone records, he spoke apparently to Mr. Sharma between 2008 and 2013. He spoke to Mr. Ashu Chawla between 2008 and 2013. He spoke to Mr. Ajay Gupta between 2015 and 2016, and spoke to Mr. Rajesh Gupta between 2015 and 2016. In the two instances, they knew each other before I was even a minister and were talking. In the two last instances, they spoke after I had left public enterprises. So it's very important to establish that context. Now, going back to the issue of the coal, the diversification, I indicated and submitted extracts from the financial statements of Alexco, that at the time I served as Minister of Public Enterprises, Alexco's financial records, financial performance, not records, financial performance was quite weak. I think it must have been in 2011 that Alexco posted a profit of 84 million rand, but that performance was prior to the establishment of the pooling and sharing joint venture with the community of Alexander Bay, which PSJV actually depleted the resources of Alexco and ensured over the next, and by so saying, I'm not blaming the community of Alexander Bay. I'm just saying that the effect of the pooling and sharing joint venture was that Alexco, whose balance sheet was already weak, began to get into even more serious financial difficulties in the years that followed. And as we saw the finances of Alexco depleting, the question that the board then raised with me, I think it must have been the outgoing board, was we need to find ways to prioritize, to reposition Alexco so that it becomes a successful entity. Now, the main focus of Alexco's business after the PSJV would have been marine diamond mining, which became difficult for Alexco because at that time they were competing with De Beers, and Alexco did not have the resources that De Beers had. There was a technology which they apparently needed, which would allow them to mine even on windy days, because the ocean in that part of Alexander Bay is quite windy, and they have more windy days than they have calm days. And so it became difficult for Alexco to compete with De Beers, because on most windy days, their operations would ground to a halt because we couldn't risk putting workers into the ocean when we knew that they were not going to be safe. That became a difficulty for Alexco. Now, there were two options that we were faced with. Either we recapitalize them to the tune of 1 billion rand, which they required for them to mine on these windy days to procure this technology, or they diversify, so that without pulling out of marine diamond mining and pulling out of Alexander Bay, they could then explore other opportunities. And that's why they were saying, among others, they would look at developing lime resources. And then they said to me, but Minister, you've presented and have been discussing with Eskom the establishment of the emerging miners coal strategy. Given that you are looking at emerging miners, and we had met with them at Eskom I think on 2 occasions, together with the leadership of Eskom, because it was a strategy developed by Eskom in terms of which Eskom wanted black emerging miners to comprise 50% plus 1 of coal suppliers to Eskom by 2018. They were spending close to 40 billion rand per annum on coal procurement, which was going to established miners, some of whom had long-term coal contracts. And Eskom wanted to begin to break that in line with the transformation objectives of the state. So Alexco then said, can we enter into negotiations with Eskom so that we explore coal mining and we also become the supplier, and perhaps the emerging coal miners could supply to Eskom through us or in partnership with us. That then was the basis of this diversification and the approach that was taken. It was based on the dwindling finances of Alexco. As the Presidential Review Committee report of 2012 indicates, Alexco was at that time one of the SOEs that were dependent on government funding in order to strengthen their balance sheet, and there were serious going concern status issues with regard to Alexco. And that was the reason why it became necessary to diversify its business, not out of mining, but to also take advantage of the fact that government had taken, the ANC and subsequently government had taken a decision to establish a state-owned mining company, SOMCO, which in our opinion and in my meetings with the Minister of Minerals, the Minister of Minerals at the time, Ms. Susan Shabangu, we thought that once SOMCO is established, it would then take Alexco over and we would merge the two mining companies so that we have one mining company, because in my opinion, it did not make sense that you would have Alexco continuing to exist, but you have another state-owned mining company which has been established. I think the issue that would need to be discussed once that happens would have been, what do we then do with the pooling and sharing joint venture with the community of Alexander Bay? And obviously, in our opinion, Alexco or the new entity would not need to pull out its key operations that remained in Alexander Bay, so that the community of Alexander Bay continues to benefit from its existence. Thank you.
Perhaps I could just take you back to paragraph 39. Did you not know of these? It says that Baggers came to public attention in 2011 when he was linked to making political introductions to Gaston Savoy, who's battling corruption charges relating to government tender awards. Been dealt with in evidence by Mr. Trevor White, Colonel Pete Deploy, before the commission. Do you not know about that?
I did not know about this, Chairperson, and I think, I don't know whether in 2012, Mr. Savoy had been arrested. I don't even know what is his status at the present moment. So, I did not know about this, and even if Mr. Begas had introduced him to, I don't know who are these political introductions, there had been no finding against him that would have made him ineligible. There are many people who on a daily basis face a lot of allegations, and they fight those allegations, and you only can take a decision on them on the basis that the allegations are proven to have been corrupt. Had we been told that no, Mr. Begas has been arrested or found guilty of corruption, yes indeed, he would either not have been appointed, or if he had been appointed, he would have been removed from the board.
At paragraph 40, and we'll come back to this, he, Begas, was instrumental in his capacity as the chairman of Alexco and the Alexco PSJV board in awarding the tender to SSI, granting it the exclusive rights to market and sell diamonds produced by the PSJV. But we'll come to that now. Can I ask you to drop down to paragraph 42?
Yes.
On 4 March 2013, Khoza was appointed as Chief Executive Officer of Alexco. Prior to this, he was the General Manager at Optimum Colliery and was clearly recruited in order to pursue the diversification into coal. Do you agree with that?
No, Chairperson.
Right.
The basis of saying he was clearly recruited, what was the basis, in fact, of saying he was clearly recruited to pursue Gigaba's agenda to diversify into coal? Here you have a general manager of a mine. The issue we're looking for was a CEO of a mine. And, you know, it happens, it's common practice that you could have a CFO of a bank, a CEO of a bank whose qualifications are in engineering. You could have ministers of finance whose qualifications are in something else. You could have, because the leadership position has to do with more than the specific area of diamond mining. It has to do with the fact that he was a leader in mining, he had experience in mining, and when the board recommended him, they considered him to be experienced enough to become the CEO of Alexco. Now, Mr. Bishop makes the wild allegation that he was clearly recruited without backing it up with any evidence or fact.
Well, I must just mention, Mr. Maibek, that one has got to be cautious that Mr. Bishop would not have personal knowledge of something.
Yes, certainly. He is an investigator from the Commission.
And I see that in some of the paragraphs, he's referring to newspaper articles and so
Yes.
on. So one has got to be cautious about what he says. So if you
Thank
can
you,
just bear
Chairperson.
that in mind, yeah.
What Mr. Bishop then deals with at page 23 was the announcement of diversity into coal mining, which you've dealt with. I just want to take you, please, to paragraph 57 at page 27. It says, significantly, shortly after the announcement by Gigaba that Alexco would be extending into the coal business to supply Eskom, well-documented Gupta-linked entities and persons, regiments and Wood, started engaging with Alexco. This is evident from the email exchanges, and then he sets out some detail of that under the heading Wood and Regiments. Did you know anything about this?
I was not. Chairperson, I have stated repeatedly at this commission that I had nothing to do with procurement processes in the SOEs, and let alone in the department over which I was minister. I was very far from the supply chain and procurement processes, so I knew nothing about this. When ministers announce policies or policy changes, whether in their departments or in the SOEs, various business people position themselves. I'm aware that when the announcement was made with regard of the strategic equity partner at SAA, or the restructuring of Eskom into 3 divisions, a number of business people began positioning themselves to take advantage of those opportunities. It has absolutely nothing to do with the ministers, or in the instance an announcement is made by the president, with the president who makes the announcement. And government policy cannot wait because there are business people who are going to be positioning themselves to take advantage of those. I think what is then required is for the supply chain processes in the SOEs to be robust enough so that the rightful people who have complied with all expected requirements for such procurements are the ones who get appointed, and not ones who may obtain such contracts through corrupt means.
And then if I could just get your comment similarly on the appointment of SSI. Could you turn to page 44, please?
Yes, I'm on page 44.
At paragraph 74, on 25 November, SSI submitted a tender.
Sorry, I went to 49.
74, 44.
Yeah,
Are you there?
yes.
On 25 November, SSI submitted a tender to the PSJV to provide exclusive diamond marketing and sales services. On 4 December, Mudley and Nathan became directors of SSI. On 17 December, the tender was conditionally awarded to SSI. Then over the page, 27 February 2015, the board approved the awarding. And then it says at 78, SSI, which changed its name to ABDC, had no license or experience in the industry, but still won the tender submitted in 2014 to be the sole agent to value, sell, and market Alex Core's entire diamond production. Alex Core's chief legal officer at the time was Kellerman Mudley, the purported 60% BE shareholder of SSI through its company, Chemo Mode, had no diamond industry background. The two directors of SSI appointed after SSI bid was submitted were Nathan and Mudley. Now this comes after you
Yes.
ended your stint as the Minister of Public Enterprises. That occurred, as I have it, in May 2014. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you have any comment on this?
No, I have no comment on it, Chair. I think except to say, of course, to confirm that this was after I had left Public Enterprises, and I don't even know who is Moodley and Nathan.
Yeah. Well, if you were not involved, I don't think there is much you can say.
And I then just wanted to point out to you at page 51 that there it was alleged by Mr. Karobi, who was a member of the technical tender evaluation committee, that Vegas put pressure on them to appoint SSI. I don't suppose you can comment on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wouldn't.
And then similarly, if you go to page 55, there was then a report commissioned and undertaken by the Bordeaux, and they found a whole lot of irregularities in relation to that set out at 132. I take it you didn't know anything about that either.
No, in 2016, right?
Sorry?
You are on page 55.
Yes.
You're referring to the Audit and Risk Committee
No, sorry, I'm referring to the Bordeaux findings and recommendations.
Oh, yes. Oh, I think this is based on what happened in 2016.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
I think unless there is something that is directed at him
Yes, certainly.
or at a body in which,
Well-
he was a member or something,
What I think I just want to put, Chairperson, if I may, is that this is, perhaps I could put this proposition to Mr. Gigaba. This is another appointment that potentially linked to the Guptas, which goes wrong because of the conduct of Mr. Vegas, who then is instrumental in appointing SSI, and SSI is also Gupta linked through Mr. Mudley.
yeah.
So that's really just the proposition that I want to put. So it's a kind of the legacy of the appointment, if you want to comment on that, Mr.
Okay, I
Gigaba.
think you can put it like that.
Thank you, Chairperson. I think it's important to bear in mind that at the time that I left Public Enterprises, there had been no appointment of SSI, and this happened after I had left. I'm sure that the people who were there at the time would be able to provide answers as to what happened, how it happened, why it happened. But insofar as I'm concerned, it had nothing to do with me. I had left, and the policy changes which I announced had no Guptas in mind. In actual fact, Chairperson, as a matter of record, in the two meetings I've referred to, where we met with the junior miners at ESCOM, the meetings were at ESCOM. Mr. Dames was there in both sessions, and there was no Gupta company there. Even Alexco, I think to my recollection, was not there, because when ESCOM put forward the policy proposal for the emerging miners coal strategy, they were thinking of the various coal mining companies of black people and women and youth that kept approaching them for opportunities to supply ESCOM with coal. A lot of long-term coal contracts were coming to an end, and ESCOM wanted to use the opportunity to begin to bring on board new players. In the meeting that I subsequently held with Mr. Kutifani, the CEO of Anglo American, we clearly clarified him as to what this policy was. that it was not a mining policy because that was not within my jurisdiction. It was not a coal policy that was not within my jurisdiction. It was an ESCOM coal procurement policy. And that's what was within my jurisdiction. All these companies, the SSIs and whatever else, were not there at the time that we were engaging with ESCOM on this.
And then just perhaps one last question. If I can ask you to go to page 57, see that sometime later in 2017, there was a proposal to establish Alex Coal. I just want to put this to you. You got the wheels in motion in relation to the diversification of Alex Coal into coal mining. Perhaps I can just direct you to paragraph 137 and ask for your comment insofar as you can. It says, the Commission's investigation team have established that the entire coal deal arising now from the proposed establishment of Alex Coal was a Gupta-linked and associated network of companies positioning themselves to control Alex coal business, which consisted of IPC, West Coal and Nungu. Should the deal have gone through, the entire coal business for Alex Coal would have been to the benefit of the Guptas and their associates. Do you have any comment on that?
Chairperson, can you please redirect me to where this paragraph?
Page 57.
Page 57.
Yeah, and I picked up from paragraph 134 and I'd read 137.
137.
At 58, yes.
Oh, no, wait. 137 at page 58. Oh,
Yes.
oh gosh, sorry. I'm unfortunately looking at the page of the memorandum itself, and that's why I'm getting confused. Page 57. And the paragraph, okay.
Do you want to start afresh, Mr.?
Yes. No, I can see it, Chairperson, thank you. Chairperson, the investigating team, I don't know the basis upon which they arrived at this. Obviously, I don't know any of these companies that are mentioned here, and the decision to establish Alex Coal must have been taken after I had left, because at the time that I left, there was no such a decision. There was not even talk of such a decision to establish Alex Coal. But what seems to be the narrative, the storyline of Mr. Bishop, the other affidavit we will go to, I suppose, Mr. Creighton, and what they based much of their findings on, the so-called 7 academics who published a book where they claimed that I set in motion the wheels for the capture of Alex Coal. It's also contained, I think, in the statement by the evidence leader that he just put to me, that I set the wheels in motion for the establishment of Alex Coal. I reject that. I reject it. It's not true. Policies are made not with the intention, or were made not with the intention to capture Alex Coal. They were based, as I said in my affidavit, which I submitted before the Commission, on the financial statements of Alex Coal and how the company was performing. What then would happen after I had left cannot be my responsibility. What we sought to achieve in 2012 when we made this, because the other affidavit goes to say, from the time of my appointment, the intention was to capture Alex. And it says I changed the boards, but the board was changed in 2012, not in 2010, not in 2011. It was changed in 2012 when the term of office of a previous board had lapsed, and it was time to appoint a new board. So there is a gap of 2 years in justifying this notion that from the time I was appointed, the intention was to capture Alex Coal. And the diversification into coal and lime had to do with the financials of Alexco, not with a view for any individual or group of companies to take over Alexco. Now, as a minister, you set the policy in motion, but the management of a company must execute that policy and find ways to ensure that it gets executed. For example, if the minister says we are announcing a long-term turnaround strategy for SAA, a number of companies would then come forward to say, can we become the consultants for SAA in the execution of this turnaround strategy? Can we become the consultants for SAA or government in the execution of the strategic equity partner? Now, those decisions get implemented by the executors, by the operators. You, as the minister, you've announced a policy. What they do with the policy, you expect that they're going to act ethically. And that's what I expected. But when I left, there was no decision to establish Alex Coal, this new company. Our expectation was that Alexco would continue implementing this decision itself.
Chairperson, sorry. I was going to
Yes,
say, could we take tea now and I can then work out, take
yeah.
stock and
Yeah,
finalize my examination?
Yeah, let's take the tea break. Which are the other affidavits that?
Well, there's just Mr. Craythorne left. He traverses very much the same ground in relation to the issues that implicate Mr. Gigaba. It's not sure, I'm not clear that I'm necessarily going to take him to that separately.
Yeah, because the real focus must be, how far does it help us? To what extent does it put up evidence that implicate him? And if it does, then we focus on that. Okay, let's take the tea adjournment. We'll resume at 11:45. We adjourn.
my own sort of football. I want to go about it. Probably won't. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's continue.
Thank you. Mr. Gigaba, could I ask you please to go to bundle 7, page 996.101.
Page 996.
996.101.
Yes. Yes, I'm there.
I directed you to this affidavit yesterday, the affidavit of Ms. Rousseau. I really only have one question for you. If you go to page 102, you will see there that it sets out a number of cash payments that were made for school fees over the years.
Yes.
Where did you obtain...
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Solomon.
Sorry, Chair, if I could just... in regard to Ms. Rousseau, I did indicate to my learned friend that we were still taking instructions from our client and would deal with it subject to Chair's consent and imprimatur by way of an affidavit if necessary. I'm not sure what the question is that Mr. Myberg wants to put, but I did tell him that it's something we haven't had an opportunity of dealing with our client in respect of, and we could just simply deal with it by way of an affidavit if necessary.
Okay, Mr. Myberg.
Well, I know that my learned friend said that yesterday. I sent him an email yesterday saying I'm going to deal with the affidavit today. I don't know how long Mr. Gigaba needs to deal with this. Really, the only question is, does he accept cash payments were made and where did he get the cash from?
Yeah.
If he feels he can't answer that now and it must go into an affidavit, well, I don't think we have any particular objection to that.
Yeah. You have had the two questions.
Sorry, just to tell...
Yeah. Mr. Solomon, I was saying you have heard what the two questions are. What the two questions are that he wants to ask. If you say, no, Mr. Gigaba can deal with them, that's fine. But if he says, if you still have a concern because you haven't had enough time, then it's fine. They can be dealt with from his point of view by way of affidavit. And I don't have a problem if you have not had enough time. But it may well be that it's something that it can be dealt with quickly, at least now that you know what the questions are.
Yes. No, we appreciate that, Chair. We'll deal with it by way of an affidavit relatively quickly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Can we, just so that we don't forget, can we put a deadline for that affidavit? Mr. Solomon?
Could we do it by Friday, Chair?
Yeah, Friday this week is fine. Yeah,
Thank you.
all right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. Mr. Gigaba, I want then in conclusion just to put some general propositions and perhaps observations to you. I don't know if you followed the evidence of Mr. Holden yesterday.
No.
Well, I suppose from what you've heard already, you would accept that on the evidence that's been presented by money flows.
By who?
By money flows.
Oh,
The money flow evidence presented in the commission. The extent of the looting by the Guptas is quite mind-boggling. You would accept that?
Yes, from what I've heard, yes.
In fact, yesterday, and Chairperson, you'll correct me because you heard it live, I think that the cost to the state increased from 50 billion to now 57 billion.
Yeah, from 49 billion to 57, yeah.
And it's quite apparent from that evidence, if it were accepted, that the Guptas were engaged in a coordinated project, and they missed few, if any, opportunities to loot the state. Would you agree with that, if that evidence is accepted?
I'm not sure, Chair, whether I'm able to just agree with it. I don't also want to dispute anything. I presume that the evidence leader is making statements.
All right. Well, perhaps closer to you, a significant part of that looting occurred during your tenure as Minister of Public Enterprises in relation to SOEs that were subject to your oversight, particularly Transnet. Would you agree to that? On that evidence?
Well, it's been alleged that evidence has been presented, but surely that doesn't mean that I was involved in it. And I think I've responded sufficiently to questions which were presented here to indicate that I myself was not involved in any of that.
Well, yes, I think wait for Mr. Mybeck to finish his propositions.
So, I beg your pardon, Chair.
Yeah, no, I meant
So the
to
proposition is simply that on that evidence, a significant, very significant part of the looting occurred during your tenure as Minister of Public Enterprises in relation to SOEs that you had oversight of, particularly Transnet. Do you have any comment on that?
I think, as I've stated, Chairperson, nothing, absolutely nothing which has been presented here places me anywhere near the money. I've not seen the money, I've not taken the money, I've not delivered money anywhere, I've not been part of the contracts. And so, to the extent that it happened during my tenure, it would be purely coincidental.
See, Mr. Gigaba, again, you, with respect, running ahead of yourself, but then let me just put the proposition to you. And the proposition is that the Guptas could not have pulled off a looting project of this size and sophistication without you being on sides in some way or the other. You want to comment on that?
Chairperson, I think let's establish a principle here that if I'm asked a question, I'm not in court. I can respond to the question as I think I can respond. But secondly, Chairperson, that I have not been told that there is a prescribed way in which I should respond.
No, nobody has said that, but Mr. Mybeck is not saying that either. Excuse me. All he was saying earlier on, I think you may be referring to the remark that you were going ahead of yourself or something like that. I think all he was saying is still to come to a proposition that he wants to put to you, which will talk about how do you come in if it has not been said that you took cash or you were part of a contract or whatever. So what you were doing is you were saying he asked the question whether you would accept that a significant portion of that looting in relation to the SOEs, particularly Transnet, happened during your term. And I think earlier on you had indicated that you accept that, but then you added that there's been no evidence that says you took cash or whatever. But he is making certain propositions. In the end, you are right to say, tell me where I come in. And that's where he was still going. So he was not seeking to say, don't answer this way or that way. It wasn't that.
In that respect, Chairperson, may I then request that he gets to the proposition so that I respond to it. Because the difficulty with responding to parts of the proposition is that when I respond to it, he says I'm jumping ahead of myself.
Yes.
Now, I don't know what is it that I'm expected to wait for.
This is where I can say to you, just answer the question that is putting to you. If having answered it, you want to see where he is going, or if ultimately you don't see where he was going with all of these questions, I'll give you a chance to say, but maybe this is the way to put it. The dots can't be connected here, you know. I will give you an answer, an opportunity before you leave, if there's anything that you feel you didn't answer adequately, we're not given a chance to answer adequately or deal with adequately, so that you can deal with it. But he doesn't want to put everything together because it can be confusing. He wants to ask one question at a time and see whether you go along with that particular question. Okay.
So the proposition, just to repeat it, is that the Guptas could not have pulled off a looting project of this size and sophistication without you being on sides in some way, Mr. Gigaba. You
That
want
is
to
not
address
true.
that?
That's not true. Absolutely not true.
But how could they possibly have pulled something off of this magnitude and sophistication without you being involved in some way? How is it possible?
In what way?
In any way, being complicit, having some knowledge, being aware, being indirectly, directly involved. How is it possible?
I don't know. Is this the point, Chair, when I respond without jumping ahead of myself?
I think you are entitled to say, look, I think the question requires you to look at what your responsibilities were as minister during that time, to say, look, as minister, this was my role, and do these responsibilities and this role suggest that there was no way I could not have been aware, or do they suggest that something as big as this could have happened without me being aware because of the responsibilities and the role of a minister? So I think the question seeks to say, if this evidence of the looting that has been given is accepted, and it's accepted that it involved as much as 57 billion rand taxpayers' money being given to this family and their entities. How could this happen? How was it possible? We had the executive. You remember I asked you one of these days to what extent there would be reports to cabinet.
Yes.
How is it possible that the whole cabinet would not be aware of this? If it wasn't aware, how is it possible that the Minister for Public Enterprises would not be aware of this? If he was not aware, how was it possible that the CEOs that were at Transnet and Eskom, at this also is, how could they not pick this up? And the CFOs and everybody. So we are bound to ask ourselves the questions. If so much money could be siphoned off to the benefit of one family and their friends and entities, what is it that didn't work the way it should have worked for this not to have been prevented from happening? But I think you must view the question in that context, as I understand it, and as I see it, it calls upon you to say, okay, what was my role as minister? did you play oversight over the board? Were you given reports that should have set alarm bells to say there seems to be something that's not going right? What about reports that were coming from CEOs or the boards, that kind of thing? I think it calls for that that kind of assessment.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I guess it's just in the manner that the questions are asked here. We lay people may not really understand how they are being presented.
No, I understand.
But I think, Chairperson, it would still be important, because if I were to reflect, I don't want the evidence leader to again feel like I'm jumping ahead. Am I at the point now when I can reflect, or there are still further propositions which are still coming, so that I
think that's fine. Just now that you understand the context, just answer the way you believe is correct to deal with it. Okay. He won't take offense, I won't take offense. That doesn't mean it's his last question, but just answer, yeah.
Thank you. Chairperson, the difficulty with our SOEs lies a great deal in the challenge that, on the one hand, they are commercial enterprises. They need to be run according to established regulations, the Companies Act, the King Code, and so on. But on the other hand, they are entities of the state. Now, as commercial enterprises, there is a formal way of reporting to the minister as the executive authority, which formal way would entail reports, the monthly reports which are submitted via the department, the quarterly reports which would include financials, as well as the annual reports which would now be tabled at the AGM. Those reports they report on specified issues. The annual report would contain the report of the company secretary on how the board has functioned. It would contain reports on the chairperson's remarks, the CEO's report, the CFO's report, the report of the auditors, and the various other committees, such as your social and environmental committees and others. By their nature, they are not going to point you to issues which have been the subject of this commission. So to the extent that you are looking at this, you are looking at what are regulated reports which come to you in the manner that they are expected to come to you as the shareholder. Without being broad, and let me try, because I think in my previous submissions I have been broad enough to address a number of strategic issues with regard to SOEs. But the reports, therefore, even when the annual financial reports talk about irregular and fruitless expenditure, it would be what you would then ask the entity through the board at the AGM, and the auditors would have asked them, what is this irregular and fruitless expenditure? And they'll explain it. It will not bring out the issues which amount to this alleged 57 billion rand, so that you can then say, no, wait a minute, let me look into this. How has this money left? Where did it go to? And so on. So it would be in the normal business of the company, and therefore it doesn't get reported specifically so that it raises an alarm with you. When you sit with the board or even on occasions when you can meet with the executive directors, they don't report to you on specific contracts. We have this contract, it's gone to those ones. There would be instances when after the contracting, if it was a big project, you are invited to now come and speak. It's an official handover. It announces the fleet locomotives. It announces a major PEE a project for the SOE. You get invited to come and speak, but you were not involved in the whole process of the contracting right until the end. And you're not going to ask those questions, because in the end, the question that they will ask, as I said, I think in reference to one or few other things, is that if I were to ask this question, what would I explain to the board to be my interest? How would I explain my interest in this matter? So the reports that come to you as the minister do not entail contracts and tenders that have been entered into by the relevant SOE. I would argue that we need to keep it that way, to insulate the executive authority from even having to be tempted to want to direct the outcome of contracts and tenders within SOEs. Because then the problem we're dealing with here would be far larger than the one that the commission has to sit and look at. Because it is not only these issues, Chairperson, which have to do with state capture or allegations of state capture that ought to concern us. It's just a whole range of things. You would talk about PPEs. I think there have been concerns to a point where government even established investigations into PPEs, people taking advantage of an entire pandemic. You would have to look at what I referred to earlier as the 2 or 3 contracts at Eskom, Midupi, Kusile, and Ingula. You would have to look at the long-term coal contracts in the SOEs. I'm saying, Chairperson, the information that comes to the minister is limited. You rely on the people who are running the institution and the entities doing what they have to do and doing it in the correct manner that they have to. You don't get yourself involved in these contracts, in the tenders that take place, and therefore you would not know or even be briefed, unless you are really lucky to be briefed about money which is being, which is being laundered. If you are really lucky, then you get that briefing, and then you can, establish an investigation, look at the matter, and have it dealt with. Now, insofar as I was involved during the time, I have said that really it is purely coincidental. It's an unfortunate coincidence, because I have lived for a long time with vilification, with innuendos, with my name being tarnished and associated with these incidents, claims being made, to which, and that's why, Chairperson, when I first came, when I came here for the second time, I really prayed that I be allowed to start answering, because as the evidence leader had indicated, there were 15 affidavits which had implicated me. they had gone on over a period, not just of 3 years of the existence of the commission, but even prior. I needed to respond to these in order to state my case, to explain my understanding of what happened, and to position myself in relation to what was happening. And so, to the extent that this happened, which is referred to as a looting exercise of this magnitude, the reports that were coming to me, Chair, would not have indicated this. And I think that's part of the reason why a commission, because even Cabinet would not have received this. All different ministers responsible for entities do not get these types of briefings, and it would be on a few occasions, as I've said, where you do, and you can then ask the president to commission the SIU to investigate an issue. But as the executive authority, you don't get these reports. They happen really far away from you. As you could see, the company, I mean, I didn't know what is Nungu investments or something like that. I didn't know this. And it cannot be true that the people who were involved in these things, appointing SSI, would then go to the minister and say, Minister, we've appointed SSI, which has the following directors, blah, blah, blah. No, they don't do that. And you don't ask. And you could very well attend a function with a company that one day would be subject to an investigation. It doesn't mean that you yourself were complicit in its appointment or in whatever wrongdoing they may have been involved in. But as the executive authority, the reports that come to you are regulated. You focus yourself on those reports and ensure that you provide the strategic directive assisted by the department to either the collective of SOEs in your portfolio or individual SOE that you are dealing with.
Mr. Myback.
Thank you. Let me put another proposition to you, and that is that it's improbable that you didn't know, Mr. Gigaba, because this looting was not being conducted by some unknown entity. It was being conducted by the Gupta brothers, one of whom was your friend. You were part of this Gupta environment.
Chairperson, I have responded to this before, that I knew Mr. Ajay, and there are many people that we all know, and many get involved in wrongdoing. And knowing a person doesn't make you complicit in their wrongdoing if they are involved in wrongdoing. I separated, and I did it deliberately. Not only in relation to Mr. Ajay Gupta, but in relation to any other business person I know. I separate myself from their business activities. I don't need to know what they are doing. And I've never been in business. I'm not in business even right now. And so whatever that they were doing, the fact that I knew them or knew Mr. Ajay does not in any possible way, that can only be established through fact, not through an inference, not through suppositions, certainly not through propositions. It can only be established through fact, which says that in this laundering of this money, this is where you come in, this is what you did, this is what you benefited. And so that proposition is also not correct.
Well, let's see where you did come in. And perhaps I can just confine myself for a moment to Transnet. You appointed Mr. Sharma as a director, and you then tried to make him the chairperson of the board. Mr. Sharma went on to become the chairperson of the BADC, and we know what happened from there. That's how you come in, Mr. Gigaba. You were the gatekeeper to the appointment of directors.
But that is also, Chairperson, that is also wrong. Because appointing somebody as the chairperson at the time, you know, if there was something wrong with Mr. Sharma at the time, then let the people who had appointed him right up to the level of DDG at Trade and Industry, who had appointed him CEO of Trade and Investment South Africa, let them also be alleged or accused of having done wrong. Because appointing someone not knowing that there is something wrong they intend doing, you know, it would be something different if it's alleged that I appointed somebody straight from prison. But if you appoint someone who has served at the highest levels of the public service of our country, and there are no allegations against them at the time, not unless you know that there is something they are going to do in the future. This proposition cannot stand because it presupposes that I should have known. And it also ignores the fact that when we presented to Cabinet that he should be chair, what were the reasons? And Cabinet said, no, don't take this direction. Not because Cabinet said he is wrong or is going to do something wrong, but Cabinet felt that the existing chair had only been in office for about 6 months and there was no reason to appoint him, to remove him from the board. We were acting on the basis of the issues that we were facing at the time, not on the basis of what would probably happen in the future. That we did not know.
But let's look at it then cumulatively. Because at Transnet, you appoint Mr. Malefe and Mr. Sharma. At SAA, you appoint Ms. Mnyeni. At Alex Corps, you appoint Mr. Baggers. At Eskom, you appoint Mr. Malicha. Correct?
Ms. Mnyeni had been a board member of SAA appointed by Ms. Hogan prior to my appointment. So she already was on the board of SAA.
But you appointed a chairperson.
Yes,
Yeah.
but that was, I think, 2012 or something like that. Ms. Mlife was appointed CEO of Transnet after having assisted the PIC to grow its capital from about 100 million to over 1 trillion by the time he left. And when he became CE of Transnet, he was an advisor, I think, to Investec or Bidvest, one of the two companies. He came highly recommended. Mr. Machila had extensive experience in electricity. And he was also a person of high repute in the energy sector. Mr. Begas also. Chairperson, you don't appoint people on the basis of supernatural power to see. And I make no allegation because they've not been found guilty of anything. I make no allegation, or I am concurring with no allegation.
Sorry, Mr. Yep. Okay, continue.
Thank you, Chair. I'm concurring with no allegation of wrongdoing on their part. All I'm saying is when you appoint someone, you do not have any foresight as to what they may be accused of at a later stage. I think it could just very well be that we had reached a stage maybe in our SOEs, and it wasn't really the first time that SOEs there were concerns that there were problems of corruption in the SOEs. But perhaps we had reached a stage of accumulation, or of culmination, let me put it like that, of culmination of the problems that were confronting our SOEs, so that the system would begin to indicate that there are difficulties here that we now need to deal with, hence the commission. My being Minister of Public Enterprises was honestly coincidental in this regard. And therefore, I also do not accept the proposition that it was because of my complicity. These are people you appointed who did this. It certainly had nothing to do with that. And I presume those people have come here to explain their roles and would still maybe in the future be expected to explain their roles in certain instances. But I was not the reason why those things to which they have answered or will still answer happened.
You see, what I want to put to you in relation to all of those people that I've mentioned is they all, to a greater or lesser extent, have become implicated in state capture and corruption, and to a greater or lesser extent took decisions that may be seen to be in favor of the Guptas. Would you then chalk that down also to an unfortunate coincidence?
Many people knew the Guptas. I'm not the only one. Many people knew the Guptas prior to me being Minister of Public Enterprises, during my tenure, after my tenure. And that doesn't mean that there was anything wrong that you did with them simply by knowing them.
And then finally, I just want to put the proposition to you that your evidence that you were unaware of what was going on is improbable, because you appointed Mr. Mahlangu to be your eyes and ears. He was there. We've seen where he was. We've seen where he popped up. We've seen what he did.
Chairperson, Mr. Mahlangu himself has denied many of the allegations which have been made against him. I think we should not ignore that fact, that there are many things which have been alleged against him, which he says, I did not do this, and so on. And Mr. Mahlangu has himself made an assertion that I conducted myself professionally in this regard. And so in that case, he has said that there are many things, or I think I've said that, which I did, which are alleged that I did, which I did not do. And even when he would have been in certain meetings, he has made clear that, but I did not put any pressure here in regard to anything. Mr. Mkwanazi says, I asked Mr. Mahlangu to accompany me so that he would listen in. Mr. Kona says, Mr. Mahlangu was there, but when this thing was put to me, that I need to support TNA, I said, follow the procurement processes of SAA. So, Mr. Mahlangu did what, he says, he conducted himself, as he says, in a professional way. What I had asked him to do was to ensure that he insulates me. Perhaps my concern at being removed from influence and other things, you can say with hindsight, perhaps I should have done it differently. But at the time, I had asked someone whom I expected, because of his legal knowledge, would be able to say, but the minister can't be involved in this, the minister can't be involved in that. And there was no instance that Mr. Mahlangu came to me and said, Minister, can I influence you to influence the following decision in favor of so and so? when he did come to me, which he said it in his own affidavit and I confirmed, was to bring to me a discussion on strategic policy issues with people from the legal fraternity, the accounting profession, as well as the advertising and marketing agencies, black marketing and advertising agencies. That much he brought to me. That much we sat and discussed, not only with the relevant organizations, but with the department. There we were dealing with a policy issue of transformation. There was no state capture or any specific transaction which related to a particular person, which he brought to me and asked me to influence. He did not do that.
And then just one final point perhaps on that. Was Mr. Mhlangu managing the Guptas or was he assisting the Guptas?
I had said manage. Keep to the extent that they may want, because they were influential in the ANC, they were in many platforms and sessions of the ANC. I had said that, look, there are these different stakeholders. Please manage them away from me.
Chairperson, that completes our leading of Mr. Gigaba's evidence.
Okay, no, that's fine. I think what I was...
Chair, just...
Yes, Mr. Solomon. I will come back to you just now.
Sorry to interrupt you, Chair.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Solomon.
Do you want to hear from me now?
Oh,
Chair, there was just one issue I wanted...
Before you come in, I'll let you come in just now. I wanted to say, I was tempted to paint part of the scenario that I am looking at when it comes to state capture. But I think I may have already painted it to Mr. Gigaba, maybe not once, maybe twice, and therefore I shouldn't. It just concerns that the Guptas may have identified certain people in SOEs, maybe in government departments as well, maybe as well as certain ministers, and they may have identified Mr. Zuma maybe quite early on before he became actually president, and so to come close to him and made whatever friendship. He gave his evidence, and I don't know whether, I can't remember whether he put it the other way, like he was the one using them rather than them using him. But they may have identified certain key people in SOEs, in government departments, and maybe some ministers in certain key portfolios, and tried to see how they could achieve whatever they wanted through making use of those connections, with or without those ministers and other people realizing. I don't know, but maybe some would be knowing and some would be, complicit. Maybe some might not have realized that they were being used. I don't know. But you just see this situation where you hear Mr. Temba Masego saying what Mr. Ajay Gupta said to him in October 2010. You see how he gets removed from his position, and Mr. Manyi gets put into this position. And Mr. Manyi does say, well, I had a relationship with the Guptas. I'm not apologizing for that, and I thought it was important to assist, I think he said black companies or something like that. And the evidence that was given was included how the sales or money spent on the new age rose by the either GCIS or certain government departments after Mr. Manyi came in. And you have, of course, during your term, Mr. Gama being reinstated as CEO of TFR under very unusual circumstances. I'm not saying that that was necessarily because of the Guptas, but it's just very strange circumstances. Of course, the commission has had evidence which he has denied, that later on, I think after he was back at some stage, that he got some money from the Guptas. He has denied that. Then you have the new age saying in December 2010, Mr. Bramleth is going to be the new CEO of Transnet. It says that at a time when he has not even applied for the position, and he gets nominated by Mr. Sharma, who is part of the board of Transnet. And then in the interviews, he's number 2. There is somebody else who is number 1, but somehow he's the one who gets appointed to be group CEO. And so you sitting in the commission, you try to make sense of all of these things, and it's important to ask everyone to make their own input so that if and when any final view is taken, one has the benefit of views from different witnesses. But I'm not inviting you to say anything, because I think I have asked you, and you have said, unless you feel a particular urge to say anything, I'm not necessarily asking you to say anything.
I think perhaps, Chair, not, except that it would also be important to check at what stage were certain individuals targeted and influenced. Was it prior to their appointment, or after their appointment, when they were viewed to now occupy critical positions? So
no, the time, I mean, all the evidence must be looked at, and the question of timing and when certain things happened, who was in certain positions and so on, would be an important factor. Okay.
Chairperson, before Mr. Solomon addresses you, can I say this? We, I think, have 1 or 2 questions that we would like to put to Mr. Gigaba that can perhaps be dealt with in an affidavit on non-contentious issues.
Okay.
At the same time, Mr. Gigaba can answer to Ms. Rousseau's affidavit.
Yes.
And then, although it's not something that I've discussed with Mr. Solomon, we'd be happy for Mr. Gigaba to then also put in an affidavit dealing with any re-examination that may be required. So we would propose 1 affidavit answering our questions and Rousseau and re-examination.
Yes.
And then the other point I just wanted to make is you would have noticed that in relation to these various 3.3 applications, some of them haven't yet been determined, and on a number of occasions, Mr. Gigaba has asked for leave for his statement to be introduced. When leading him, it's been on the assumption that those statements will be allowed in. Perhaps just to regularize it from a procedural point of view, might I suggest that just before Ms. Ngoma gives evidence, I might hand up to you, Chairperson, an order that you could then, or a ruling
admit them,
that you could then make, just admitting them all. It would be quite a tedious process to go through that now.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Mr. Solomon?
Thank you, Chair. I think Mr. Myburgh's answered my untimely interjection, which I apologize for.
Yes.
That's in order. We'll deal. There was just one question I wanted to deal with in re-examination.
Yes.
Which we can do by way of an affidavit.
Okay, no, that's fine. I also had wanted to check with you whether you were going to wish to re-examine or whether you were going to wish to have whatever issues you wish to have clarified, have them clarified by way of an affidavit. But if you are happy with that, then that would be fine. I think that from my point of view, Mr. Gigaba.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that.
Yes, I think from my point of view, the one thing that I would like you to deal with also, either in the affidavit that is contemplated or in a separate affidavit, is the decision to appoint Ms. Myeni as chairperson of the SAA board, what it was informed by. And to the extent that you are able to, it would also be helpful to assist me by giving me a picture of the skills spread within the SAA board at the time. What kind of skills and qualifications and experience were possessed by other board members. I ask that question in particular because the evidence that has been placed before the Commission suggests that Ms. Myeni may have played a very significant role in challenges at SAA. And as I said to you the other day, one is forced to ask the question, how were board members appointed? How was somebody made the leader of the board, the chairperson of the board? And so on. So I ask you to deal with that because of that context. Yeah. Okay, all right. I think we are going to, I'm going to excuse Mr. Gigaba and Mr. Solomon now. As I understand it, the only outstanding matter is apart from the affidavits that must still come in, or affidavit, is the issue of the cross-examination of Ms. Mngoma.
Yes.
Is it now accepted by everybody that's coming up on, is it Tuesday next week? Or
Yes, it is Tuesday, subject to you
yes.
informing us at what time
Yes.
you would be available for that.
Yes. I think at this stage, let's work on the basis of 10 o'clock, but I might indicate and ask that we start earlier if need be. Mr. Solomon, you probably do have an idea of how much time you think you will take with her. I think usually when I grant leave to cross-examine, I say I will determine the amount of time for cross-examination just before the cross-examination starts. Do you have an idea? I've worked on the assumption that because a lot of her evidence is evidence that Mr. Gigaba says is fabrication, I worked on the basis that you should not take long with her. Have you got an idea of what you think how long you might take? I will still determine, but it would be good to know in advance what your own thinking is.
Yes. Yes, certainly, Chair. I hadn't thought about it because I was going to be guided by you, but I thought 2 hours of that order?
Well, if you say 2 hours, that coincides with what I thought you would not exceed. You know, I thought you would either be shorter than that, but not exceed that. So maybe we can work on the basis that you would work towards completing it earlier, or at least not more than 2 hours.
Yes, Chair. Can I say happily that you and I were of the same mind?
Yes, I think we are. Okay, all right. We will.
Thank you, Chair. No, I'll try and be less than that, but not more.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine. Mr. Gigaba, I'll excuse you now. I see, Mr. Mybeck, that we are at 1:45.
Yes.
Let me excuse Mr. Gigaba so he can leave. Yes. Okay. What do you propose? We have Brigadier Gigaba, who must give evidence. He's not cross-examining anybody. He must give evidence at some stage this afternoon. My recollection is that he should not be long. So we could, if Mr. Benjamin is here, we could start with him, maybe 15 minutes. Maybe we go up to 15:15 if it's going to take 30 minutes, and then take the lunch break after that, or break at 1 o'clock. He continues after 2.
If it's in order with you, could I propose that Mr. Benjamin give evidence now? I'm quite sure that his evidence will probably be less than half an hour.
Yes.
With your leave, my colleague, Ms. Siegels Ngubi, is going to lead Mr. Benjamin.
Yes.
So we just need to shuffle our papers, but we can certainly, I'm sure, deal with him in 20 minutes.
Okay, no, that's fine then. Shall I adjourn for 5 minutes?
Thank you, Chairperson.
Yes, we'll adjourn for 5 minutes. We adjourn. greeted everybody who was here in the morning, but in case some were not here, you are greeted as well. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairperson.
And we haven't seen you in a long time.
Yes, Chairperson, I've been working behind the scenes. Happily so.
No, at least as long as you are still with us.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good afternoon, Mr. Benjamin. Yes.
Chairperson, before Mr. Benjamin takes the oath, I just thought for the benefit of the public to explain what his evidence would be about this afternoon.
Yes.
Mr. Benjamin is one of the Commission's investigators dealing with the Transnet stream, and he will be giving evidence today on a review of an M&S report and his further investigation into the relationship between Mr. Salim Issa and Mr. Iqbal Sharma, who was appointed a Transnet board member by former Minister Malusi Gigaba at the time. The evidence is largely based on documentation that Mr. Benjamin procured, as well as a diagram in the M&S presentation, which he will take the Commission through.
Okay, thank you.
If he may take the
Yes,
oath now.
please administer the oath of affirmation.
Please state your full names for the record.
Clarence Benjamin.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No.
Do you consider the oath binding on your conscience?
Yes.
Do you solemnly swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The technicians must just switch off this screen here. Okay, yes, continue.
Thank you, Chairperson. We'll be using Transnet bundle 7B this afternoon.
Yes.
And I'd just like to get Mr. Benjamin to confirm his affidavits contained in there.
Yeah.
Mr. Benjamin, if you could go to Transnet bundle 7B, page 1178.
I'm on 1178.
And if you could go to page 1183.
1183, yes.
Do you confirm that this is your affidavit?
I do.
And on page 1182, do you confirm that that is your signature?
1182, yes, that's my signature.
Do you confirm the correctness and truthfulness of your affidavit?
I do.
And then if we can just deal with the annexures from page 1185 to page 1199.
Yes,
Do you confirm that those are the annexures to your affidavit?
I do.
Okay. And then there's a second affidavit that you deposed to, which is a supplementary affidavit on page 1200.
Correct.
Can you go there, please?
I am there.
To page 1203.
I'm there.
Do you confirm that this is your supplementary affidavit?
I do.
Do you confirm on page 1202 that that is your signature?
I do.
Do you confirm the correctness and truthfulness of this affidavit?
I confirm that.
And then insofar as the annexures are concerned, from page 1205 until page 1215, do you confirm that those are the annexures to the supplementary affidavit?
I confirm that.
Okay. Thank you, Chairperson. If these affidavits could be admitted into the bundle as Exhibit BB30.
Let's take one at a time.
Yes, Chairperson.
And deal with it, have it admitted, and then the next one.
Okay.
Which one do you want us to start with?
The first affidavit on page 1178.
should we mark that one as? Should be
Chairperson,
exhibit what?
BB 30, 30.1.
The affidavit of Mr. Clarence Sidney Benjamin that starts at page 1178 is admitted as an exhibit and will be marked as exhibit BB 330.1 together with, or there are no annexures to it, or are there?
The annexures are included in, it's until
together
page
with
1199, Chairperson.
Together with its annexures. Okay. Is the next one the one at 1200?
Yes, Chairperson, that's the supplementary affidavit, which is until page 1203.
So this one will be BB 30.2.
Correct, Chairperson.
The supplementary affidavit of Mr. Clarence Sidney Benjamin that starts at page 1200 is admitted together with its annexures and will be marked as exhibit BB 30.2.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Those are the only two.
Those are the only two affidavits.
Okay, all right.
Mr. Benjamin, if we could start with the first affidavit, which is on page 1178. Are you there? Can you just switch on your microphone? Yep. Are you there?
I'm there.
Okay. Can you just explain to the chairperson how it came about that you prepared this affidavit?
Yes, Chairperson. I was requested by the evidence leader of the Transnet stream to verify the accuracy of the M&S report that was prepared on October 2018, and specifically the aspects of the M&S report that dealt with the conflict of interest regarding Mr. Iqbal Sharma and Mr. Salim Essa. That's why I started, just to verify the accuracy of the information contained in the M&S report.
And just for clarity, your affidavit doesn't necessarily deal with the conflict of interest. It simply deals with the business relationship between Mr. Sharma and Mr. Essa.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. You make no findings about any conflict of interest?
No.
Okay, correct. If we can then proceed with the affidavit, sure. In particular, page 1179, we're operating with the black numbers. There you set out what you have just indicated to the chairperson now about how it came about that you investigated you prepared this affidavit. Now, in particular, you refer to, at the foot of the page, paragraph 8, you refer to an annexure CB1. That would be the extract from the M&S report, is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Okay. If we can then go to annexure CB2, in fact CB3, which is the relevant annexure that you want to take the chairperson through, that is to be found on page 1199, chairperson. Can you identify this document for the record?
The document on page 1199 is extract from a presentation given by M&S. And for the purpose of my affidavit, I use this as a background because it's a good diagram explaining the co-directorship and the co-shareholding in the various companies for both Mr. Essa and Mr. Sharma.
Okay, and keeping your hand on that page, if we can go to page 1180, that's where you deal with the business relationship between Mr. Sharma and Mr. Essa. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Can you just set out for the chairperson the various companies that you identified where there is a business relationship between the two?
Yes, Chairperson, on page 1180, on paragraph 11, I've listed 6 companies in which Mr. Sharma and Mr. Issa had a share interest, either as co-directors or co-shareholders. And I've listed them in paragraph 11. And I'll just go through the list and I'll go into detail at a later stage. The companies are Algazolf Pty Limited, VR Laser Services Pty Limited, VRLS Properties Pty Limited, Isar Capital Pty Limited, and over the page on 1181, the National Agricultural Development Project Pty Limited, and lastly, a company called Daku South Africa Pty Limited.
Okay. Can we then go back to our diagram on page 1199? And perhaps let's start with Algazolf. And in particular, the first block in blue, where it deals with Mr. Issa and Mr. Sharma's directorship. If you could just read that into the record.
Correct, Chair. On the diagram on page 1199, the block indicating Algazolf Pty Limited, it's stated there that Mr. Issa was an active director in that particular company, and Mr. Sharma declared a 50% interest in Algazolf on the 28th of the 2nd, 2013.
Okay, now if we can go to the supporting documents in respect of that, on page 1192, which is Annexure CB2 of your first affidavit.
What's the page number?
Page 1192, Chairperson.
Okay.
Can you identify this document for the record?
Yes, this is the SABC report for Algazolf Pty Limited, and it indicates who the directors were in that particular company on particular time periods.
Who prepared this report? Who extracted this report?
Sorry?
Who extracted this report from the...
I extracted this report from the SABC records.
Okay, and what does it indicate?
It indicates in the middle of that particular page, Chair, that the active director there in Algazolf is Salim Aziz Issa, and he was appointed on the 2nd of the 12th, 2013, which reconciles with the diagram on page 1199 that we've referred to.
Okay, and then in respect of Mr. Sharma, Annexure CB4, which is on page 1205, Chairperson.
1205.
1205.
Okay.
Can you identify this document?
Yes, Chair. The document on page 1205 is the declaration of interest in contracts submitted by Mr. Sharma to the Transnet Corporate Secretariat, and I obtained this document from the Corporate Secretariat at Transnet.
What is its date? When is it signed by him?
This is signed on the 28th of February 2013.
Okay, and what is it that you want to identify on this document?
What I want to identify in this document is just above the signature. Mr. Sharma indicates his interest in Algazolf Pty Limited, and under the column percentage held, he indicates a 50% interest in Algazolf Pty Limited, which again reconciles with the diagram on page 1199, the block relating to Algazolf Pty Limited.
And what is the date of appointment identified by Mr. Sharma for the Algazolf Pty Limited?
Sorry, Chair?
What date of appointment does he identify in his conflict declaration of interest. It's the second last column.
2012. 2012.
Then if we can go back to the diagram on page 1199. And to the right of the block that we were dealing with, if you could just explain about the ownership of the shares of Algazolf.
Yes, Chair. Algazolf owns 74.9% of the shares in a company called VR Laser Services Pty Limited. And if you look at the block on the right-hand side of that page, that Mr. Issa was the active director of VR Laser Services Pty Limited from the 14th of January 2014.
Okay, if we can first just deal with the first submission that you made, which was that Algazolf owns 74.9% shares in VR Laser. If we go to CB5 of your supplementary affidavit on page 1207.
Yes.
Can you identify this document?
Yes, this is a share register for VR Laser Services Proprietary Limited.
And what does it indicate?
It indicates, share on the far right column of the share register, that in a third row that Algazolf Proprietary Limited owes 749 shares in VR Laser Services. And if you look at the total shares on page 1209, the issued capital of VR Laser Services is 1,000, which means that Algazolf owns 74.9% of the shares in VR Laser Services Proprietary Limited, which again reconciles with the diagram on page 1199.
Okay, and then if we go back to the diagram on page 1199, the next block is what you just told us about now, VR Laser Services, and that Mr. Issa is an active director. In that regard, can we go back to Annexure CB2 of your original affidavit, and that's on page 1193.
I'm there.
Can you again identify this document?
Chair, this is again an extract from a SABC report for VR Laser Services that I extracted from the database of the SABC company.
And what does it indicate?
Chair, in the middle of that extract, under active directors, the first director that's mentioned there is Salim Aziz Issa, and his date of appointment is the 14th of January 2014, which again reconciles with the diagram on page 1199.
Okay, and then back to the diagram on page 1199. If we look at to the left of the first block, which says Algazolf owns 80% shares in NADP Pty Limited. What is NADP Pty Limited?
It's a National Agricultural Development Program company.
Okay, and in that regard, you indicate that in NADP, if you can just read into the record the block that refers to NADP active directors.
Yeah, the active directors in NADP was Mr. Sharma from the 7th of 11, 2013, and Mr. Issa from the 7th of 11, 2013.
Okay, and in that regard, can we then go back to CB2, page 1196?
I'm there.
Okay. On page 1196, can you identify this document?
This is again an extract from the database of SABC, and I've extracted the SABC report for the National Agricultural Development Project.
And can you tell us what does it indicate?
At the bottom, the last paragraph on that page, it discloses the active directors in the NADP, which are Mr. Salim Aziz Essa, appointed on the 7th of 2013, and Mr. Iqbal Mir Sharma, also appointed on the 7th of 2013, which again reconciles with the diagram on page 1199.
Okay, and in respect of, back to page 1199, you then also deal with Al Ghazal's shares in NADP.
Correct, yes, that Al Ghazal owns on page 1199, it's indicated that Al Ghazal owns 80% of the shares in NADP.
Okay, in that regard, can we go to Annexure CB6 in your supplementary affidavit, which is on page 1211.
I'm there.
Okay, and can you identify this document for us?
Yes, again, Chair, that's also an extract of the share register for the National Agricultural Development Project P2I Limited.
And where do we see the ownership of Al Ghazal?
That will be in the second block of page 1211. It states here that Al Ghazal Proprietary Limited in the far right-hand corner owns 80% or 80 shares in the NADP. And if one goes to the last page of the share register, which is on page 1213, the total issued share capital of NADP is 100, which means that Al Ghazal owns effectively 80% of the shares in NADP.
Okay, and then if we go back to our diagram on page 1199.
I'm there.
There's the block dealing with ISA Capital.
Correct, ISA Capital. And it indicates there that the active directors in ISA Capital from the 17th December 2010 to the 22nd of May 2014 is Mr. I. Sharma.
Okay, in that regard, can we go to CB2 of your original affidavit on page 1195?
I'm there.
Can you again identify the document and tell us what it depicts?
It's again an extract that I made from the SABC records, and this extract relates to the company called ISA Capital.
And what does it depict?
It indicates the second last block on that page that the director of the company is Mr. Iqbal Mir Sharma. He was appointed on the 17th of the 12th, 2010, and he resigned on the 22nd of May, 2014.
Okay, and then back to page 1199, you then deal with Issachar Capital's ownership in VRLS properties.
Yes.
And what does the diagram indicate?
The diagram indicates that ISA Capital owns 100% of the shares in VRLS properties.
And in that regard, can we then go to Annexure CB7 in your supplementary affidavit on page 1215? Can you just identify that document?
Yes, Chair, this is a share certificate issued by VRLS Properties.
And what does it indicate?
It indicates that Isar Capital owns 100 shares in VRLS Properties.
Okay. And then insofar as ISA Capital, back to page 1199, my apologies. To the left of the block dealing with ISA Capital, there's also its ownership in NADP. Can you indicate what that says?
Sorry, just repeat that question.
NADP, ISA's...
Oh yes, Isar Capital owns 20% of the shares in NADP.
If we can then go to Annexure CB6 in your supplementary affidavit on page 1211.
Yes, Chair. I'm there.
Can you tell us what it says about ISA Capital?
Yes, just below the shareholding of Algazolf that we've previously mentioned, the 80% in NADP, just below that, there's the shareholding of Isar Capital, and it states there that Isar Capital has got 20 shares in NADP, which gives it effective shareholding of 20%.
Okay, and then finally dealing with, on page 1199, VRLS Properties. It's the last block.
Yep.
Yes.
In the last block, Chair, it's indicated Mr. Sharma is a former director of VRLS Properties from the 9th of the 12th, 2013 to the 12th of the 10th, 2015.
In that regard, can we then go to CB2 in your original affidavit on page 1194?
I'm there.
Can you identify the document for us?
The Chair, this is again an extract from the company records through SABC, and this is SABC records for VRLS Properties.
And what does it indicate?
In the very last line of that page, Chair, it indicates resigned directors, Mr. Iqbal Mir Sharma, and he was appointed on the 9th of the 12th, 2013, and he resigned on the 9th of the 10th, 2015.
Okay, and then finally in your affidavit, you make reference to the link between VR Laser Services and VRLS Properties. If we can go to your affidavit on page 1182. And in particular, paragraph 15.
Yes, I'm there.
Can you read that into the record?
I can read that. M&S pointed out that VR Laser was listed as an active Transnet vendor, which had previously done business with Transnet to the value of approximately 200,000 rand per year since 2006.
Thank you. Chairperson, that concludes Mr. Benjamin's evidence.
Thank you. Mr. Benjamin, this investigation which you did here, do you know from your colleagues in other work streams of the Commission whether similar exercises have been done with either all board members or certain specific board members who are alleged to have had some connections with the Gupta family? Because it would be good to have a picture in regard to each board during a particular time who may have had interests, who may have shared interests in certain entities with one or other Gupta person or entity.
We haven't done such exercise in detail, Chair. What we've looked at is, at Transnet specifically, we have looked at declarations of interest from various board members, and I'm not aware of instances where we found conflict, where there was conflict of interest listed in those declarations, other than the one that MNS actually pointed us to in 2012.
Of course, the MNS report does have quite some information about certain board members and the Gupta family or their entities. But I think it would be good, depending on how much job would be involved in doing this. Maybe it might not need to be done in respect of every member of the board, but certain members who have certain allegations against them. Maybe it could be done so that one would be able to say, when one could look at certain transactions that are tainted, that happened during certain periods, and look at who the board members were and see if they had interest in certain entities. Where one could do that with ESCOM, with Denel. I know, for example, with Denel that, at least I think according to the MNS report, there were certain members who had some interest connected with the Gupta family or entities. But one would like to have a clear picture, and I would imagine that it shouldn't be a job that would take too much, but you would know better.
No, I'm talking specifically about it, but about the Transnet stream, Chair, but I mean, various other streams have done similar exercises, so it's not that we have to do an exercise like that from scratch. I think a lot of the information is available. One just needs to consolidate it into one report or something.
Yes. Well, the Transnet workstream legal team is listening. You are here. I think the issue could be looked at, and you could share the information with the head of the investigation team. But I think it would be good to have that situation, to have something along those lines. So basically one could have an affidavit like this in regard to each SOE work stream. I mean, SAA, SABC. I know that the members of the legal team relating to those might no longer be around. But there are lots of things that the investigation team is able to do on their own. But ESCOM definitely, Denel definitely, and Transnet you have already done. But you focused on Mr. Sharma here only, and I don't know whether that's because you didn't do the others, or you did do them but there was nothing. But it would be good to have some picture, even if it didn't cover everybody. So if it can be done, I know it's late in terms of our time frames, but whatever can be done might be helpful if it's possible. Okay, all right.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Right. Thank you. You are now excused. Thank you for availing yourself to assist. We'll take the lunch adjournment now. Oh, you will not be coming back?
No, Chairperson. Mr. Myburg will take her.
Well, I think even he won't be coming back. Yeah, and I guess he must be happy. He has been on his feet these days for very long periods. Yes. Okay, all right. We'll take the lunch adjournment, and we'll resume at 25 past. Let me just make it 2:30. That's when we'll hear the evidence of Brigadier Gigaba, I think.
Thank you, Chairperson.
We adjourn.